after describing the nature of your sincerely held belief, then you have to state what accommodations you're requesting. The best accommodation that you can get is work from home. And one thing that's really great, yeah, it's a good accommodation to have. But one thing that's really great about the pandemic is that so many employers sent their employees home to work remotely. And by doing that, the employer showed their hand by saying that, hey, this is not a burden on us for you to work from home. In fact, you should do it, like we want you to. And so when you allege an exemption, the only way the employer can really deny it, there's really two ways as far as their religion. They can try to say it's not sincerely held by finding some objective reason, like I mentioned, like, oh, you take Advil, so that's not, Or they can say, well, it's an undue burden on us. And if they've already allowed you to work remotely, then they've already established that's not really a problem for them. So they don't really have a leg to stand on legally if they've been allowing you to work remotely. Now, some people are in the situation, let me see what I got on the next slide. Okay, so this goes into the interactive process. So after you allege your sincerely held belief, and then you request certain accommodations, which I can get into more examples of that, the employer is obligated to enter into what is called the interactive process. So the interactive process is kind of it's like a negotiation. It's a give and take. It's an open conversation. You say, this is the accommodation that I want. Other examples of accommodations other than working from home, that's the most obvious and the easiest to get, is if if you're sometimes required to come into the office to attend meetings, I see a lot of that. Or if you're sometimes required to travel to go to a meeting, I see a lot of that. You can request, well, can I do that by video conference? That shouldn't be a problem for a lot of employers. Now, if that is not possible, and you absolutely have to be in the office for something, like today I talked to a client who works for a federal contractor and they do some kind of top secret type stuff. They have to be there because there's no other way to do that remotely. They have all these security protocols and stuff. And so if you're in a situation like that, it's slightly more difficult, but this is just simple logic, okay? So follow me here for a second, and I think you're probably already all thinking this, but okay, so I put this in my letter. There is nothing out there that says that if you are a vaccinated person, having the vaccine prevents you from transmitting it to somebody else, whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated. It's the other way around, right? What they say, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but what they say is that the vaccine is supposed to, one, prevent you from having a serious case of COVID-19. We've seen that hasn't really held up too well, I think, so that's one part of it, and then the other part is it prevents you from getting it, or it's supposed to. It provides some protection. But there's nothing out there that I've seen, and I could be wrong, but I have not seen anything that says getting this vaccine prevents you from giving it to somebody else. I don't think that's a thing. And so, that being the case, this is very logical. There's no undue burden there's no burden at all on the employer in accommodating you, even if you have to go into the office, because you can say, well, I'm really only assuming the risk for myself, because I'm not putting anybody else at risk. If the vaccine is supposed to protect them, then they're protected. And I'm perfectly happy to assume the risk with my religious belief, and that shouldn't present a burden to anybody. I'm not a danger to anybody else. I think that's very logical. And then you can also, that's just, your employer's probably going to argue with you about that, but that is really, that's reality. And if this goes to court, if this issue were to go to court, your employer would have to put on evidence that that's not the case, because they have to prove an undue burden. So the law is really on your side when it comes to that. Other accommodations that you can request, and people have varying opinions on what they're willing to do and not do, but you can say, well, I'll social distance and I'll wear a mask. That's what we've been doing the whole time, I will submit, and this is a controversial one, but I'll submit to regular testing. Or if you're in a situation where you mostly work remote, but sometimes you absolutely have to be there, then you can request, I'll do a test, I'll show a negative test. Now, a lot of people have a problem with the nasal swab test. I personally have a problem with that. And the reason is, what we found is that the swabs themselves are treated with something called ethylene oxide, which is a known carcinogen. It absolutely does cause cancer. It's been proven to show that. Now what they'll say is, well, it only contains trace amounts. Okay, well that's fine, but you're still asking me to shove something that contains trace amounts of a known carcinogen up my nose, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever. And then there's also, well, what if they shove that thing too far up your nose? I'm sure a lot of people have heard, it's bad. People have had brain bleeding. There's some kind of membrane up there. I forget the technical term, but if you puncture that, it can cause serious issues. So the argument there, you can actually request, and I've seen some success with this, you can request an exemption from the nasal swab test because it's kind of the same type of logic. So once, kind of in my letter, which all of you will get, it walks through that my body is the temple of the Holy Spirit and that whole analysis, and then it says, this is defiling to the temple of the Holy Spirit, this is defiling to my body because I am you're asking me to knowingly put something in my body that I strongly believe is very harmful to my body and does not provide any benefit because we all know that COVID-19 has a very high survival rate, and I'm not a risk to anybody else, which we already went through. And so, it says basically the difference is this vaccine, we all know, it's mRNA, it's not a traditional vaccine, it instructs your cells to produce a spike protein that they would not otherwise produce. And we have no idea how that's going to affect the human body years from now. I tend to think it's going to be pretty bad, and I'm sure a lot of people agree. I'm sure some of you have also seen the videos of other, there's a lot of rumors going around, there's nanoparticles and all sorts of weird toxic substances in these vaccines. So, but the point is, we have no idea, because the vaccine's only been around for 2 years or less, so we have no idea how it's going to affect the human body years from now. And so you're saying to the employer, it is against my belief, it's against my religion to put this in my body because there's no real benefit, and there's all these risks that are completely unnecessary, and it's changing the way God created my immune system to function, it's changing the way God created my cells to function. So with the nasal swab test, you can kind of make a similar argument. You can say, well, again, I'm not more of a risk to anybody else than a vaccinated person is, and you're asking me to do this test that's really dangerous. It can be dangerous, and I can develop cancer from this. So that is also against my religious belief, to knowingly do something harmful to my body. So I have had some people get exempted from the test. And just to encourage you, I've actually been seeing, most employers right now are sitting on these exemptions. They're not getting back to us very quickly. But this week I got 3 people have their exemptions granted, and that was really exciting. 2 of them were nurses. Actually, I think I had 4. 2 of them were Raytheon employees. I don't know if we have any Raytheon folks here, but Raytheon was initially, they were gunning for it, and then they have backed off. I think the rumor mill is that they're just routinely granting religious exemptions now, so that's very, very encouraging. Hopefully some other employers will follow suit. So you state your accommodation, the employer comes back and says, okay, these are the accommodations we're willing to give you, and then you can say, well, I won't do that one. It's just this whole negotiation process. And that's why a lot of people like to get me involved for one of the flat fee packages, because during this process, people inevitably have questions. I get questions from my clients every day. Hey, they came back and said this. Hey, they want me to fill out this form. What do I do? And so I'll take a look at it and be like, okay, yeah, don't fill that out because you already submitted a letter. It covers that whole thing. Actually, perfect example from this last week. I'm sure a lot of you are dealing with this situation. Employers will try to box you in with their forms. They will make you think that you have to fill out this form. And the law, if you read the case law and just all the law behind Title VII and Chapter 21, to trigger this interactive process and put the burden on the employer to evaluate your accommodation, all you have to do is those 2 steps. Allege your sincerely held belief and tell them what accommodations you want. There's no form, there's nothing in the law that says you have to fill out your employer's form. Now, I will say that it's kind of I would encourage, if your employer is really that hardcore and they're just like, we're gonna fire you if you don't fill out our form. I have seen that. And they have all these check boxes, they're just completely ridiculous. Who's dealt with the check boxes that are just unbelievable? Yeah, several people, a lot of people, it looks like probably about a dozen people out there. So they'll say, check this to acknowledge that I'm a risk to everybody around me, and check this to acknowledge that I'm gonna, yeah, I mean, it's mostly just about, it's like shaming you, like I'm just gonna acknowledge that I'm a danger to everybody when I come into the workplace, and it's unbelievable. And they'll say, you have, and they won't even let you submit the form unless you check all of those boxes. So what I tell people in that situation is, go ahead, if the employer's that hardcore, they won't even look at your exemption unless you check all these boxes and fill out their stupid little form. Fine, we can sort that out in court later. I don't think, in my legal opinion, an employer is not allowed to box you in like that, but that's something that would be worked out in court later. So you kind of have to, if your employer is really forcing you, you kind of have to do it. So what I advise people to do is check all those boxes, even if you don't agree with them, and then there'll usually be like text boxes that you have to describe your exemption. And so I just tell people, just put, hey, I had to check all this to submit this form, but I don't agree with this, I don't agree with that, I don't agree with that, and here's why. So you can kind of type in your own statements, and then you can put in, what accommodation you want and what the basis of your sincerely held belief is. So that's how I would handle the form issue, and I'll be taking questions later, so any questions you have about that, I'll answer it. And so, let's see, I don't think we need anything else about the interactive process. At the end of the interactive process, let's see, what else, did I miss anything here? Oh yeah, okay, so they can request additional information from you, and I kind of like that little cartoon. We have ways of making you talk, and it's a clock. I got a repairman there. Anyway, so they can come back for additional information, like if there's some objective reason to question the sincerity of your religious belief, they can ask you a few questions about that, and that would be again where you would probably want to call me or email me and be like, hey, they're asking me this, what should I tell them? And then I haven't really talked a whole lot about medical, they're technically known as ADA accommodations. That's what a medical exemption is. And it's really the same analysis. You allege a medical condition that you have that would put you at more risk than somebody else of having an adverse reaction to the vaccine. And with that one, you don't really have to go into as much detail with the sincerely held religious belief, because the religious belief is really kind of in your mind, right? It's your personal view, but the medical condition is something that's objectively verifiable. So what you should do is just tell your employer, hey, I have a medical condition that puts me at a greater risk of suffering an adverse effect from this vaccine, and you don't really have to go into much more detail than that. And then your employer will send you a form that you can give to your doctor, or they will just directly give your doctor a form, and they'll just say, hey, who's your doctor? We'll send you a form. I've been on both sides of this. I was an HR director for all of 6 months, but I did do a lot of this, and defended employers who screwed up the process when I used to work for the law firm. So I'm very familiar with this, and it's just kind of like the medical exemption. You either have it or you don't. Either your doctor's going to back you up on it, or they won't. Now, what's shocking is some employers are just that hardcore. Even if you have a note from your doctor, they're not even accepting that. So it just wildly varies. It wildly varies from employer to employer. I don't know if anybody works for Texas Health. I had an employee a couple weeks ago who asked for a religious accommodation, and they were pushing back a lot. So she was just like, hey, can you just deal with this? So I reached out to the employer, talked to them, and they just said, we're just categorically denying religious exemptions. I was like, can you confirm that? I was like, you're just, it doesn't even matter, you're not even gonna look at it. I was like, that's pretty blatantly against the law, so that would not work out well for them in court, but I guess they're just banking on people aren't gonna sue them, I don't know. It's weird. So yeah, they can ask clarifying questions, but a commonly asked question is, do I have to provide a note from my pastor? So that would be like, if, a lot of employers will be like, you have to attach a note from your pastor. That's not really a requirement. You can push back and say, hey, go read the EEOC guidelines, because it specifically says that you don't get to ask me for additional documentation unless you have an objective reason to doubt the sincerity of my belief. So what's your objective reason? Why do you need to know from my pastor? What reason do you have to doubt the sincerity of my belief? I would put the burden back on them.